There are some days that never leave your heart. You remember every little sound, every face, every word. For me, that day began with the smell of fresh coffee and ended with the sound of my own front door closing behind me. The strange thing is, I didn't cry. At least, not where anyone could see. When my daughter-in-law looked at me and quietly said, "Maybe it's time for you to find another place to live," I simply smiled. It wasn't because I agreed with her. It wasn't because her words didn't hurt. I smiled because I knew that if I cried, my son would look away. And somehow, that would hurt even more. My name is Margaret. I am 71 years old, a widow, and the mother of one son. For most of my life, I believed family was the safest place in the world. I spent 42 years married to my husband, Thomas. We never had much money, but our little home was filled with laughter, warm dinners, and quiet evenings on the porch. When Thomas passed away from a heart attack, everything became quiet. Too quiet. I remember sitting alone at our kitchen table after the funeral. His coffee cup was still sitting beside the sink. His reading glasses were still on the newspaper. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to move them. It felt like moving them would mean accepting that he was truly gone. People often say that time heals. Maybe it does. But I think time simply teaches us how to carry the pain without dropping everything else. Our son, Daniel, visited every weekend after his father died. He would mow the lawn without asking. He fixed the leaking faucet. He carried groceries inside and stayed for dinner. Sometimes we didn't even talk very much. Just having him there made the house feel alive again. One Sunday, while washing the dishes together, he smiled and said, "Mom, I met someone." I turned toward him with soap still on my hands. "You did?" He nodded, looking happier than I had seen him in years. "Her name is Emily." I smiled so wide that my cheeks hurt. After losing Thomas, seeing my son smile again felt like watching the sun rise after a long winter. A few weeks later, I met Emily for the first time. She was beautiful. She dressed neatly. She spoke softly. She brought me fresh flowers. "They're your favorite," she said. I looked surprised. "How did you know?" Daniel laughed. I told her. Emily smiled warmly. I wanted to make a good first impression. And she did. That afternoon, we shared tea in my little kitchen. She complimented my homemade apple pie. She asked about Thomas. She listened while I told old family stories. When she left, I hugged Daniel before he reached the car. "I like her," I whispered. He looked relieved. "I hoped you would." The wedding happened the following spring. It wasn't fancy. Just close family and a few friends gathered in a small church. I cried during the ceremony. Happy tears. Watching my son promise to love someone for the rest of his life reminded me of the promises Thomas once made to me. As they danced together during the reception, I silently prayed that their marriage would be filled with kindness. I wanted them to have everything Thomas and I had shared, maybe even more. For the first year, everything seemed wonderful. Emily invited me over for Sunday dinners. She asked me for recipes. Sometimes she called just to ask how I was doing. When Daniel had to work late, Emily stayed with me and watched old movies. I remember thinking how lucky I was. Not everyone gets along with their daughter-in-law, but somehow I had gained another daughter. Or at least, that's what I believed. About 2 years after the wedding, Daniel called one evening. His voice sounded careful. "Mom, can we talk?" "Of course." He cleared his throat. "Emily and I have been thinking." I smiled. Whenever young couples say that, they're usually planning something exciting. Maybe a baby. Maybe a vacation. Maybe buying a house. Instead, he quietly said, "We think you should move in with us." I didn't answer right away. He continued, "You've been living alone since Dad passed away. The stairs worry me. And honestly, we'd feel better knowing you're with us." My heart felt full. I thanked him. Then I hesitated. "I don't want to become a burden." "You never could," Daniel replied. Emily took the phone. "We'd love having you here." Those words stayed with me. "We'd love having you here." A month later, I packed my belongings. Not everything. Only what I needed. A few boxes. My favorite chair. Thomas's photo. Some family albums. And the small wooden music box he had given me on our 20th anniversary. Leaving my home was harder than I expected. I walked through every room one last time. I touched the kitchen counter where I had rolled pie dough for decades. I stood beside the bedroom window where Thomas and I watched rainstorms together. Then I locked the front door. I whispered, "Thank you," not to the house, to the life it had given me. Daniel and Emily welcomed me warmly. They had prepared the guest bedroom. Fresh flowers sat beside the bed. Clean towels were folded neatly. Emily even framed a picture of Thomas and placed it on the dresser. When I saw it, my eyes filled with tears. She hugged me gently. We wanted this room to feel like home. For several months, it truly did. Every morning I helped make breakfast. I folded laundry, watered the flowers, cooked dinner twice a week. When they both worked late, I cleaned the kitchen before they returned. I never wanted them to think I expected to be taken care of. I wanted to help. I wanted to belong. Sometimes all three of us would sit on the back porch after dinner. Daniel talked about work. Emily laughed about funny customers she met during the day. I mostly listened. Those evenings reminded me of simpler times. The house felt peaceful, safe, complete. Looking back now, I wonder if the cracks had already begun. Maybe they were too small for me to notice. Or maybe I simply didn't want to see them. Because when you love someone deeply, your heart often explains away the little things your eyes quietly notice. And without realizing it, that was exactly what I had begun to do. The first signs of change were so small that anyone else might have missed them. They were not loud arguments. There were no slammed doors, no cruel words, just little moments that quietly settled into our home like dust on an old bookshelf. At first, Emily stopped asking for my recipes. She had always loved cooking with me. We laughed together while peeling apples or stirring soup. Sometimes she even wrote little notes beside my recipes, so she would remember them. Then one afternoon, I walked into the kitchen carrying my old recipe book. "I thought we could make your favorite chicken pie tonight," I said with a smile. Emily barely looked up from her phone. "That's okay, Margaret. I already ordered dinner." "Oh," I replied softly. "Maybe another day." She smiled politely. Maybe. That maybe never came. A few weeks later, I noticed something else. The family dinners slowly disappeared. Daniel started eating in front of the television after work. Emily often said she wasn't hungry until later. Sometimes I ate alone at the kitchen table. I told myself everyone was simply busy. Life changes. People grow tired. I understood that. Or at least I wanted to. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I decided to surprise them. I baked Daniel's favorite apple pie. It was the same recipe his father loved. The smell filled the whole house. For a moment, I felt 20 years younger. When Daniel came home, he smiled. "Mom, you made pie." I thought it might brighten everyone's evening. Before he could cut himself a slice, Emily walked into the kitchen. She looked at the pie, then at me. "We're trying to eat healthier." Her voice wasn't angry, just flat. Daniel slowly put the knife down. "I forgot," he said quietly. "It's okay." I smiled. "We can have it tomorrow." But the pie stayed untouched. 3 days later, I wrapped it in foil and threw it away. As it landed in the trash, I felt something inside me fall with it. Not because of the pie, because I had made it with love. And somehow, love no longer seemed welcome. The house itself began to feel different. Emily rearranged the living room. She moved my favorite chair into the spare room. "I wanted a cleaner look," she explained. I nodded. "It looks nice." The truth was, that chair had been where Thomas used to sit whenever we visited. Seeing it disappear from the room felt like watching another small piece of my life quietly packed away. I never complained. I didn't want to become the difficult mother-in-law people joked about. So instead, I stayed quiet. Quiet became my closest friend. One afternoon, I overheard Emily talking on the phone. She didn't know I had come back inside after watering the flowers. "I just wish we had more privacy," she said. There was a pause. I know she's trying to help. Another pause. But sometimes it feels like she's always here. Those words stayed with me all day. Always here. I want to laugh at how strange that sounded. Of course I was always there. I lived there. But suddenly I understood something. To me, it was home. To Emily, I was a guest who had stayed too long. That evening, I apologized for something she had never said directly. I'm sorry if I get in your way. Emily looked surprised. You don't. But her smile didn't reach her eyes. The next morning, I began spending more time in my room. I started reading after breakfast. I listened to old music through headphones. Sometimes I simply looked out the window. The maple tree in the backyard had started losing its leaves. Each one drifted quietly to the ground. Watching them fall reminded me that change doesn't always happen all at once. Sometimes, it happens one leaf at a time. Daniel noticed I had become quieter. One evening, he knocked on my bedroom door. Everything okay, Mom? I smiled. I'm just tired. You've been spending a lot of time in here. I don't want to interrupt you too. He frowned. You never interrupt us. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But belief becomes difficult when actions begin whispering a different story. A month later, Emily returned from shopping with several bags. She excitedly showed Daniel new decorations for the house. They laughed together while hanging pictures and moving furniture. I offered to help. What can I do? Emily paused. We've got it. I stood there for another moment, then quietly returned to my room. From behind the closed door, I could hear them laughing downstairs. I smiled anyway, not because I wasn't lonely, because hearing my son happy still mattered more than my own sadness. As Christmas approached, I suggested inviting the whole family over like we always had. Daniel looked interested. That sounds nice. Emily quickly answered. I was actually thinking we could have a quiet holiday this year. Oh, I replied. Just the three of us? She hesitated. Actually, my parents are coming. I smiled again. That will be lovely. She didn't ask if I minded. She didn't need to. The decision had already been made. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow outside. Emily's parents filled the living room with conversation. They exchanged gifts, shared stories, laughed over breakfast. I sat in my usual chair with a cup of tea. No one ignored me, but no one really included me either. I had become invisible without anyone meaning to make me feel that way. Sometimes loneliness isn't about being alone. Sometimes it's sitting in a room full of people who no longer notice you're there. Late that afternoon, Daniel handed me a small wrapped box. Merry Christmas, Mom. Inside was a soft blue sweater. It'll keep you warm. I hugged him tightly. It's beautiful. Emily smiled politely. I'm glad you like it. I truly did. But what I wanted most couldn't be wrapped. I wanted our family back. The one that laughed over homemade dinners. The one that stayed up talking on the porch. The one where I never questioned whether I belonged. As winter turned into spring, I noticed Daniel changing too. He called me Mom less often. Instead, conversations became shorter. We're busy. Maybe later. I'll let you know. None of those words sounded unkind. But together, they slowly built a wall between us. I often wondered whether he noticed, or whether he believed this was simply how families changed over time. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I accidentally placed one of Emily's sweaters in Daniel's drawer. It was an honest mistake. Emily sighed loudly. I just organized everything. I'm sorry. I'll fix it. She took the sweater from my hands. I think it might be easier if I handle the laundry from now on. Her words were polite, but they carried something heavier underneath. Something that quietly told me, you are no longer needed here. That evening, I sat alone on the back porch. The wind moved gently through the trees. The sky turned orange as the sun slowly disappeared. I remembered something Thomas once told me many years ago. He had looked at our little boy playing in the yard and smiled. No matter how old he gets, he said, he'll always know where home is. I closed my eyes. I whispered into the evening air. I hope that's still true, because deep inside, I had begun to fear that my son no longer knew where to find me. Not because he couldn't see me, but because someone else had quietly changed the map. There's a kind of silence that feels peaceful. Then there is another kind. The kind that slowly settles between people who once spoke without thinking. That was the silence growing between my son and me. It wasn't because we argued. It wasn't because we hated each other. It was because, little by little, we stopped sharing our lives. Daniel still left for work every morning with the same smile. He still asked if I needed anything from the grocery store. He still kissed Emily goodbye before walking out the door. But when he looked at me, I began to notice something different. He no longer really saw me. He saw someone who was simply there. One Saturday morning, I woke early and made pancakes. It had been our tradition since Daniel was a little boy. Every Saturday, Thomas would make coffee while I mixed the batter. Daniel would sneak pieces of chocolate from the cupboard when he thought I wasn't looking. Those mornings were some of my happiest memories. As the pancakes cooked, the familiar smell filled the kitchen. For a moment, it felt like the past had returned. Daniel walked downstairs. He smiled. Pancakes. I thought we could have breakfast together. Before he could sit down, Emily entered the kitchen. Oh, she said. We were actually planning to go out for brunch. Daniel looked at me, then at Emily. His smile faded. I forgot. It's all right, I answered quickly. You two should enjoy yourselves. Are you sure? Of course. He hugged me before leaving. I'll bring you something back. I'd like that. I watched them drive away through the kitchen window. The pancakes grew cold on the table. Around noon, I packed them into a small container. The next morning, I ate them alone. They tasted nothing like they used to. A few days later, I decided to visit my old neighborhood. I hadn't been back since selling my house. The new owners had planted flowers in the front yard. The porch swing Thomas built was still there. Seeing it made my heart smile. I didn't knock. It wasn't my home anymore. Instead, I sat on a nearby park bench. Children laughed as they chased one another. An elderly couple walked hand in hand. I realized something that afternoon. Places change. People move. But memories stay exactly where we leave them. When I returned home, I found Daniel and Emily sitting quietly in the living room. The conversation stopped as soon as I walked in. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't know you were talking. Emily smiled. It's nothing important. But Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. I walked upstairs. Not because I believed they were talking about me. Because I was afraid they were. That night, sleep refused to come. I stared at the ceiling for hours. When you grow older, your mind becomes a scrapbook. It opens without asking. I remember Daniel's first day of school. How tightly he held my hand. I'm scared, he whispered. I knelt beside him. You'll be all right. He looked into my eyes. Promise. I promise. Back then, he believed every word I said. Now, I wasn't sure he believed me at all. Spring slowly turned into summer. Emily suggested repainting the house. It'll feel fresh. I agreed. Daniel spent the weekend painting walls. I offered to help. I can paint the guest room. Emily gently shook her head. No, Margaret. We'd rather you rested. I smiled. I don't mind working. We've got it. Again, those words. We've got it. Little by little, every job I once did disappeared. Cooking, laundry, shopping, gardening, even watering the flowers became Emily's responsibility. At first, I thought she was trying to help me. Eventually, I realized she was helping me become unnecessary. One afternoon, I accidentally overheard another conversation. Emily didn't know I was upstairs. I just think your mom depends on us too much. Daniel answered quietly. She's alone. I understand, but we're trying to build our own life. There was a long pause. Then Emily spoke again. You always choose her feelings over mine. My heart stopped. Daniel answered so softly, I almost couldn't hear him. I don't. Those two words should have comforted me. Instead, they frightened me, because he sounded as though he was trying to convince himself. The following week, my birthday arrived. I never cared much about gifts. I simply enjoyed spending time together. When I woke up, the house was quiet. No balloons. No breakfast. No card on the table. I smiled to myself. Maybe they were planning something for the evening. Around noon, Daniel called. Happy birthday, Mom. Thank you, sweetheart. I'm sorry. Sorry. I have to work late. Oh. Emily took the phone. We'll celebrate this weekend. That sounds lovely. The weekend came. Nothing happened. Neither of them mentioned my birthday again. I didn't remind them. Some disappointments are easier to carry quietly. Several days later, I opened my dresser drawer and found an old birthday card Thomas had written many years ago. It simply said, "Thank you for making every ordinary day feel like home." I sat on the edge of my bed and cried for the first time since moving in. Not because they forgot my birthday, because someone who truly loved me had never forgotten how much small moments mattered. As the months passed, Daniel began spending more evenings at work. Emily often said he had important meetings. Sometimes he came home exhausted, sometimes frustrated. Whenever I asked if he was all right, he always answered the same way. I'm fine. I knew he wasn't. Mothers know, even when their children become grown men. One rainy evening, the power went out. The whole neighborhood became dark. We gathered in the living room with candles. For a little while, something beautiful happened. Without phones, without television, without distractions, we simply talked. Daniel laughed at an old childhood story. Emily smiled. I felt hope returning. Maybe we had simply lost our way. Maybe we could still find each other again. When the light suddenly came back on, everyone stood up. Emily checked her phone. Daniel answered a work email. The moment disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. I quietly blew out the candles. Sometimes I think families aren't broken by one terrible event. They're broken by hundreds of tiny moments when people stop choosing each other. One evening, Daniel came into my room holding several envelopes. They're bills. I know. We need to talk about expenses. I looked confused. I've been giving you money every month from my pension. I know. Emily stepped into the doorway. The costs have gone up. I understand. I offered them a little more. Nearly everything I could spare. Daniel looked uncomfortable. You don't have to if it's difficult. It isn't. But it was. Not because of the money. Because for the first time, I no longer felt like family. I felt like a tenant. That night, I opened my little wooden music box. The one Thomas had given me years before. Its gentle melody filled the room. I closed my eyes and whispered, I miss you. Not because I wanted to leave this world, but because you were the last person who always made me feel wanted. Outside my bedroom window, summer rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside the house, everything was quiet again. Yet somehow, the silence had become louder than ever. And deep inside my heart, I began to fear that something much bigger was coming. I just didn't know how soon my greatest fear would become my reality. People often imagine that heartbreak arrives like a storm. Loud, sudden, impossible to ignore. But sometimes it comes like a quiet knock on a bedroom door. So soft that at first, you don't even realize your whole life is about to change. That morning began like every other. I woke before sunrise, made myself a cup of tea, sat by the kitchen window, and watched the birds gather on the fence. The house was peaceful. Emily and Daniel were still asleep. I remember thinking how grateful I was for another ordinary day. I had no idea it would be the last ordinary day I would spend in that house. Around breakfast, Daniel looked unusually quiet. He barely touched his food. Emily avoided looking at either of us. The silence around the table felt heavy. After Daniel left for work, Emily began clearing the dishes. Then she stopped. She took a slow breath. Margaret, can we talk? My heart became strangely nervous. Of course. She sat across from me. For a long moment, she simply looked at her hands. Finally, she spoke. I've been thinking about our living situation. I nodded politely. So have I. She looked surprised. I think. She began carefully. It might be better if you found a place of your own. The words were gentle, almost kind, but they landed like stones. For a few seconds, I honestly believed I had misunderstood her. I'm sorry, I whispered. What did you say? I think you would be happier living independently. I smiled, not because I believed her, because I suddenly understood why she had been distant for so many months. This conversation hadn't started today. It had been happening inside her heart for a very long time. I looked toward the family photographs hanging on the wall. One picture showed Daniel as a little boy sitting on Thomas's shoulders. Another showed our first Christmas after Emily joined the family. I remembered how happy we all looked. Then I quietly asked, Does Daniel know you feel this way? She hesitated. We've talked about it. That answer hurt more than anything else, because it meant my son had known, and he had never warned me. I nodded slowly. I understand. Emily looked relieved. I hope you're not angry. No, I wasn't angry. I was simply tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. That afternoon, I stayed in my room. I looked around at my small collection of belongings. The framed photograph of Thomas, the music box, a few books, my blue sweater from Christmas. Everything I owned fit inside one bedroom. I realized something then. I had spent 2 years trying not to take up too much space, until eventually, I had almost disappeared. Daniel came home earlier than usual. He knocked softly on my door. "Mom, come in." He stepped inside but remained standing. There was sadness in his eyes, yet he couldn't quite meet mine. "Emily told me you talked." "Yes." He rubbed his hands together nervously. "We've just been under a lot of pressure." "I know. The house feels crowded." "I know. You deserve your own place." I looked at him for a long time. "Daniel." "Yes." "Is this what you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked toward the floor. That silence became my answer. Perhaps he truly wanted me to leave. Or perhaps he simply didn't know how to disagree. Either way, the result would be exactly the same. I smiled gently. "You don't have to explain." "I'm sorry." "I know you are." He sat beside me on the bed. For a moment, he looked just like the little boy who used to crawl into my lap after bad dreams. "I never wanted to hurt you. I believe you." Things just became complicated. I reached over and held his hand. Life often does. He finally looked at me. There were tears in his eyes. Mine stayed hidden. One of us needed to remain steady. And mothers become very good at carrying both their own pain and their children's. That evening, I quietly began packing. I folded each piece of clothing with care. Not because I had many things, because every item represented another chapter of my life. When I wrapped Thomas's photograph in a towel, I whispered, "We're moving again." The words made the room feel painfully empty. Emily stood in the hallway for a moment. "I can help if you'd like." I smiled kindly. "Thank you. But I think this is something I need to do myself." She nodded. There was guilt on her face. I could see it. But guilt doesn't always change people's choices. Sometimes it simply follows them afterward. The next morning, I called my old friend Helen. She answered on the second ring. "Margaret." "Helen." The moment I heard her voice, my own almost broke. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath. "I need to find somewhere to live." She didn't ask questions. She didn't judge anyone. She simply said, "You'll stay with me until we figure things out." Kindness has a quiet voice. It never asks for attention. It simply opens the door. 3 days later, my suitcases stood beside the front door. The same door I had walked through believing I was coming home. Now I was leaving with even fewer things than I had brought. Daniel carried my boxes to the car. Neither of us spoke much. There were no dramatic arguments. No shouting. Only silence. Heavy. Endless silence. Before getting into Helen's car, I turned back toward the house. The curtains moved gently in the breeze. Flowers bloomed beside the porch. It still looked warm. Still looked welcoming. Homes often look beautiful from the outside. You can never see the loneliness living inside them. Daniel hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry, Mom." I wrapped my arms around him. "I love you." "I love you too." I waited, just for a second, hoping he would say, "Stay." He never did. He simply stepped back. Emily stood quietly near the doorway. She gave me a small wave. I smiled, not because my heart wasn't breaking, but because I refused to leave with bitterness. Bitterness would only become another suitcase I'd have to carry. As Helen drove away, I looked through the rear window. My son became smaller. Then the house disappeared around the corner. I didn't cry. Not yet. Some tears wait until there is no one left to comfort. Helen reached over and gently squeezed my hand. "You don't have to be strong today." I looked out at the passing streets. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure where home was anymore. That night, lying in Helen's guest room, I couldn't sleep. The room was warm. The blankets were soft. I was safe. Yet I felt as though I had lost something that could never be packed into a suitcase. I hadn't only lost a place to live. I had lost the feeling that my son needed me. And somehow, that hurt far more than losing the house itself. As rain began tapping softly against the bedroom window, I whispered one final prayer before closing my eyes. Please let my son remember who I have always been. Because deep inside, I still believed the boy I raised was there somewhere. I only feared that someone else's voice had become louder than mine. The first morning at Helen's house felt unfamiliar. I woke before sunrise, just as I always had. For a few quiet seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I looked around the small guest room. The pale blue walls, the little lamp beside the bed, the vase of fresh flowers Helen had placed on the dresser. Everything was kind. Everything was welcoming. Yet it wasn't home. I quietly made my bed and walked downstairs. Helen was already in the kitchen, humming softly while making tea. She smiled the moment she saw me. I wasn't sure if you'd still wake up this early. I laughed for the first time in weeks. I don't think that habit will ever leave me. She poured me a cup of tea and placed it gently in front of me. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Some friendships don't need constant conversation. Their comfort lives in the silence. Finally, Helen looked at me. You don't have to pretend you're all right. I stared into my tea. I don't know who I am anymore. She reached across the table and touched my hand. You're still Margaret. You're still the woman who helped half this town when they needed someone. You're still the mother who loved her son with everything she had. No one can take that away. Her words settled gently inside my heart. Not because they erased my pain, but because they reminded me that pain doesn't erase who we are. Over the next few weeks, I slowly settled into a new routine. Helen refused to let me feel like a guest. We cooked together, worked in her garden, walked around the neighborhood every evening. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we simply enjoyed the quiet. Little by little, I noticed something surprising. I wasn't walking on eggshells anymore. I no longer worried whether I was taking up too much space. If I left a cup on the counter, no one sighed. If I baked bread, someone smiled. If I laughed, no one looked uncomfortable. I had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without apologizing. Still, every evening around 6 o'clock, I found myself looking toward the driveway. For just a moment, I imagined Daniel pulling up in his car, stepping out, walking to the front door, saying, "Mom, come home." But every evening, the driveway remained empty. One afternoon, while helping Helen organize old boxes in the attic, I found a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. "They're from my husband," Helen said softly. "He wrote one every week while he was overseas." She smiled as she held them. I still read them. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I opened my own box of memories. Inside were birthday cards, old photographs, school drawings Daniel had made when he was little. One drawing showed our family holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Above our heads, he had written in crooked letters, "My family stays together forever." I traced those words with my finger. Children believe forever is simple. Adults learn how fragile it can be. Nearly a month passed before Daniel finally called. His name appeared on my phone late one evening. For a long moment, I simply looked at the screen. Then I answered, "Hello." "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded tired. "How are you?" "I'm all right." There was an awkward pause. "I've been busy." "I understand." Another silence. Then he quietly asked, "How's Helen?" "She's taking good care of me." "I'm glad." It wasn't much of a conversation. 5 minutes at most. But after we hung up, I cried. Not because he called, because I realized how carefully we spoke to one another now. As though we were strangers trying not to say the wrong thing. Several weeks later, I received a handwritten letter. At first, I thought it was from Daniel. Instead, it was from Emily. She wrote only one page. She thanked me for everything I had done over the years. She apologized if she had ever made me feel unwanted. Then she ended with one sentence that stayed with me. "I thought creating space for my marriage meant asking you to leave. I don't know anymore if I made the right choice." I folded the letter slowly. There was no anger inside it, only uncertainty. For the first time, I realized something important. Emily wasn't a villain. She was simply a young woman trying to protect what she believed was her family. And in doing so, she had forgotten that I was part of that family too. A few days later, Helen invited me to volunteer at the local community center. They need someone to help with reading hour. I haven't done anything like that in years. So, she smiled. Children don't care how long it's been. That first afternoon changed something inside me. The children listened carefully as I read stories. They laughed, asked questions, One little girl hugged me before leaving. See you next week, Miss Margaret. Those simple words filled an empty place inside my heart. For the first time since leaving Daniel's house, someone needed me again. Not because I cooked, not because I cleaned, simply because I was there. The weeks turned into months. Autumn arrived once more. The trees outside the community center glowed, with shades of gold and red. Life continued moving forward. Slowly, quietly. One Saturday afternoon, Helen and I visited the farmer's market. As we walked between the stalls, I suddenly heard a familiar voice. Mom! I turned around. Daniel stood only a few feet away. He looked thinner, older somehow. His smile appeared uncertain. I didn't know you came here. I come with Helen sometimes. He nodded. Can we talk? Helen gently squeezed my shoulder. I'll wait by the flower stand. Daniel and I sat on a nearby bench. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at his hands. The house feels different. I waited. So quiet. I suppose that's what Emily wanted. He shook his head slowly. No, it's not. I looked at him carefully. What happened? He sighed deeply. I thought if everything became easier between Emily and me. He paused. I'd feel happier. Do you? His eyes filled with regret. No. We stopped laughing. We barely eat together anymore. The house doesn't feel like home. For the first time in a very long while, I saw my little boy again. Not the grown man trying to please everyone. Just my son. Confused. Hurting. Searching for answers. I wanted to tell him that I had warned him. That I had seen this coming. Instead, I simply placed my hand over his. Sometimes people don't need reminders of their mistakes. They simply need someone who still loves them after making them. The afternoon sun warmed our faces as we sat together in silence. Neither of us knew what would happen next. But for the first time since I left, there was a tiny crack in the wall that had grown between us. And through that small opening, hope quietly found its way back. The afternoon I met Daniel at the farmer's market stayed with me for days. His face looked different than I remembered. Not older because of time, older because of regret. There is a certain sadness that appears when people finally understand the cost of the choices they made. I had seen that look once before. It was in my own mirror after Thomas passed away. Sometimes life teaches us lessons only after we've already paid the price. A week later, my phone rang again. It was Daniel. Mom, would you have dinner with us? His voice sounded nervous. I closed my eyes for a moment. The old hurt was still there, but so was my love for him. I'd like that, I answered quietly. On Sunday evening, Helen drove me to the house. The same house I had left carrying 2 suitcases and a broken heart. As we turned into the driveway, memories came rushing back. The flower beds were still there. The porch light still glowed warmly. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet I was not the same woman who had left months before. Helen smiled before I got out. Remember who you are. I will. She squeezed my hand. I'll be waiting if you need me. When I walked to the front door, Daniel opened it before I had a chance to knock. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he wrapped his arms around me. I'm so sorry, Mom. This time, neither of us tried to hold back our tears. We simply stood there. A mother. A son. 2 hearts finally admitting how much they had missed one another. When we stepped inside, Emily was waiting in the dining room. She looked nervous, more nervous than I had ever seen her. The table was set with my old blue plates, the ones I had packed away years earlier. The smell of roasted chicken filled the room. My favorite meal. Emily noticed me looking around. I remembered what you liked. I smiled gently. Thank you. Dinner was quiet at first. Not uncomfortable. Just careful. 3 people trying to find the words that had been missing for far too long. Halfway through the meal, Emily put down her fork. I owe you an apology. I looked at her without speaking. She took a slow breath. When you moved in, I truly wanted us to be one family. I know, but after a while, I became afraid. Afraid of what? I asked softly. She looked down. I thought Daniel still needed you more than he needed me. I understood then. This had never really been about the guest room, or the cooking, or the laundry. It had been about fear. Fear has a quiet way of changing love into distance. Emily continued. Instead of talking honestly, I started building walls. I convinced myself that if you left, everything would be better. A tear slipped down her cheek. It wasn't. Daniel reached for her hand. She held it tightly. Then she looked back at me. I didn't realize I wasn't protecting my family. I was breaking it. The room became still. I thought about every lonely meal, every forgotten birthday, every night I cried without anyone hearing. I could have listed every painful memory. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you for telling me the truth." Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It simply refuses to let pain have the final word. After dinner, Daniel brought out an old photo album. We laughed over pictures from family vacations. Emily smiled at photographs she had never seen before. For the first time in years, the house sounded alive again. Not because everything had been fixed, because everyone had finally stopped pretending. As the evening came to an end, Daniel walked me outside. The air was cool. The stars were beginning to appear. "I've been thinking," he said. "I don't want you living alone." I smiled. "I won't. Helen's wonderful." "She is. But—" He hesitated. "I also don't want to lose you again." I looked at him for a long moment. "My dear boy, you never lost me. You only stopped looking." He lowered his head. "I don't deserve how kind you've been." I gently lifted his chin. "Love isn't something people deserve. It's something we choose. And I choose to keep loving you." A few weeks later, Daniel and Emily visited me at Helen's house. Then they came again the following Sunday. Soon, Sunday dinners became our tradition once more. Sometimes I cooked. Sometimes Emily did. Sometimes we ordered food and laughed when dessert arrived before the main course. No one worried about perfection anymore. We had learned how easily precious moments can disappear. One afternoon, Emily arrived carrying a small box. I found something while cleaning. Inside was the little recipe notebook she had borrowed years earlier. The pages were worn from use. Tiny notes filled the margins in her handwriting. "I never stopped making your recipes," she admitted. "I just stopped making them with you." I smiled as I turned the pages. Then I looked at her. "Would you like to make the apple pie together?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I'd love that." As we stood side by side in the kitchen, measuring flour and peeling apples, it felt as though another small piece of our family had quietly found its way home. Not back to the way things had been, but towards something wiser, kinder, more honest. Months later, I moved into a small cottage just a few streets away from Helen. It wasn't large, but it was mine. I planted roses beside the front porch, hung Thomas's photograph above the fireplace, placed the little wooden music box where the morning sunlight could reach it. Every Sunday, someone visited. Sometimes Daniel, sometimes Emily, sometimes both of them together. One spring afternoon, they arrived carrying exciting news. Emily smiled nervously. "We're having a baby." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel laughed through happy tears. "Mom, we were hoping." He looked at Emily. She nodded. "We were hoping you'd teach us how to be good parents." I smiled through tears of my own. I've been waiting my whole life to hear those words. When my granddaughter was born, Daniel placed her gently into my arms. She wrapped her tiny fingers around mine. I whispered the same promise I had once made to her father so many years before. "You'll be all right." Life has a remarkable way of giving us another chance. Not to relive the past, but to love better than we did before. Now, when people ask whether I ever forgave my daughter-in-law, I always give the same answer. Yes, not because forgetting is easy, but because carrying bitterness is much heavier than carrying grace. I also learned something about my son. No one truly turned him against me forever. He simply lost his way for a while. Like many people do, love did not disappear. It became buried beneath fear, misunderstanding, and silence. Once we found the courage to speak honestly, love found its voice again. If you're listening to my story today, perhaps you're carrying a hurt of your own. Maybe someone disappointed you. Maybe someone chose silence when you needed love. If so, I hope you remember this. Families are not held together by perfect people. They are held together by humble hearts willing to say, "I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please forgive me." Those simple words rebuilt my family. Not overnight, Not perfectly, but one conversation, one shared meal, one act of kindness at a time. These days, when I bake apple pie, my granddaughter stands beside me on a little wooden stool, just as her father once did. She steals tiny pieces of apple when she thinks I'm not looking. I always pretend not to notice. Some traditions are worth keeping. And every time the warm smell of cinnamon fills my little cottage, I smile. Because after everything we lost, love found its way home again.